Welcome to the Doppelgänger Conversations. I acknowledge first the traditional custodians of the ancient lands on which we all virtually gather for this conversation, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I acknowledge that the land, sea and sky were never ceded and pay my deepest respect to the elders past, present and future. The Doppelgänger, Explorations on the Original and the Copy in the Post-Digital Age, is a research project for which the University of South Australia, the SIDA Foundation and the David Roche Foundation awarded in 2020 a research fellowship. The Doppelgänger as a project is an investigation into the potentials and promises, as well as the limitations and specificities of digital technologies in design. The David Roche Foundation's Fermoy House and its collection of decorative arts has been the site of investigation for this project. The house, the archive, and parts of its collection have been documented through video recordings, 360 photography, 3D LiDAR scanning, creating digital copies of the Foundation's collection and spaces. Today is one of several conversations which are part of this fellowship. With my guests, I explore themes, topics, and concepts from design and architecture to philosophy and art, which are all related to the investigation we're undertaking in this project to the topic of Doppelgänger. My name is Rochus Hinkel. I'm the recipient of the 2-year research fellowship in interior design and decoration, and I'm an associate professor for architecture and design at the Melbourne School of Design at the University of Melbourne. My guest today is Esther Anatolitis, and we are exploring philosophical concepts on the creative relationship between the original and the copy. Welcome, Esther.
Hello, Rock. It's great to be here.
Thanks. Great to have you, Esther. We know each other for quite a few years now. I think we can say many. Therefore, it's a little bit easier to talk to you. It's like, like having another conversation, one of many. But before we start, I'd like to introduce Esther to our listeners or viewers. Esther had many different roles and a long list of achievements. And even if you might seem that might be a long list I'm reading out or referring to, it is actually the short list of all her achievements. Esther is one of Australia's leading advocates for arts, culture, and the creative industries. She promotes a critical reflection on practice and active civic engagement. Esther is deputy chair of the Contemporary Arts Precincts, who have recently opened Collingwood Yards in Melbourne, and a former board member of ACME, Elbow Room, the Arts Industry Council Victoria, and Regional Arts Australia. Since 2004, you have held creative industry CEO positions, and in 2020, you were appointed Honorary Associate Professor at RMIT School of Art. Esther has facilitated and collaborated on creative projects across a range of media and locations, and her critique has a strong focus on visual, spatial, and experimental art, including sound and text. Her academic background is in European philosophy, and she holds a postgraduate certificate from the Bauhaus in Dessau, Germany. Esther was curator of Digital Publics Melbourne and Sydney, co-facilitated independent convergence across 3 years, and curated the Sunday Saloons with Dr. Ben Eltham and Tasneem Chopra OAM. She's a member of ICA Australia, the copyright agency, and NAVA. Esther's past leadership roles span across craft and design, literature, visual arts, performing arts, festivals, galleries, publishing and broadcasting. Esther has held CEO-level positions with several key arts organizations, including Melbourne Fringe, Graph Victoria, Sin Media, the Emerging Writers Festival, Express Media, Regional Arts Victoria, where you led the Small Town Transformation Program of Arts-led Regional Renewal. Most recently, Esther was Executive Director of NAVA, where in your final month, you led the National Collegiate Advocacy Focus during the pandemic and presented the 2020 Advocacy Program. Esther's work has been published widely. You write a lot of, comments and commentary in many, many different formats, including in Australia and overseas. Maybe the most prominent one, The Guardian and The Age. And I'm really happy to have you here. And I asked Esther to speculate with me on the topic of the original and the copy. Can copies become more relevant than originals? Was one question. Or is a copy an original work? To start the conversation, I like to introduce and mention the philosopher Umberto Eco, who died 2016. He was an Italian philosopher, cultural critic, political and social commentator, but mostly known as novelist, especially in English with his best-known novel, The Name of the Rose, and Foucault's Pendulum, which he published, I think, in 1988. In 1992, Eco wrote in an essay, which was published in a publication named Understanding Origins, edited by Francisco Varela and Jean-Pierre Dubois from École Polytechnique in Paris, France, and published by Springer for the Boston Studies of Philosophy and Science. Eco writes that the question of the original and the copy is similar to other philosophical and semiotical notions, for example, originality and authenticity, as well as the concepts of identity and difference. Eco talks in his essay about the doubles, which are like those two chairs we're looking at, so sitting in front of, that they are identical but interchangeable. Eco suggests that the only solution is to try a professional and commonsensical definition of forgery and fake in order to cast in doubt some of our definitions of truth and falsity. To reference another great thinker for much longer ago, Aristotle states that things whose matter is formally or numerically one, and things whose substance is one, are said to be the same. I think that's kind of maybe not helpful, but interesting. In the world of university and higher education, there's a big topic of original research, contribution to knowledge, finding the gap in a PhD, but even in undergraduate study, the question of plagiarism. So who is there to say what's an original or copy? Who will be the judge? Is it sometimes just a matter of which came first, Esther?
Massive, big intro, Rochus, and so much to respond to there. And I think it's when we bring together Umberto Eco looking at semiotics, looking at, the basic building blocks of meaning, which is, the various linguistic copies that make up language, and then compare that to Aristotle looking at, mimesis and poiesis, looking at reproduction as opposed to the creation of something new. They're just... we're in a world now where the possibility of reproducing something, creating a copy, creating a backup, creating a truth or falsity, is the basis of society and the economy, let alone the way that we relate to one another. So I think it's a very timely set of topics and questions that you have chosen, and especially to be in this context where we are.
Yes, so do we want to go political and talk about fake news?
Oh, we have to go political, don't we? The whole political notion of representation, of representative democracy, is that we choose someone to represent us. And we have this notion that representation is like a copy. This thing is substituted for this other thing. But when we elect someone, then we probably want someone like us, but a little bit better, because they'd be more confident, they'd be more articulate, they would know the system better. But as soon as we're saying that they're like us but better, then they're different. They're not like us. It's not a representation. And it goes to, questions of mechanical reproduction. You want the copy to be the same and better in some way, more durable, more detail, more, because why would we want a copy that's exactly the same with all the faults? So I think the political question, whether we're talking about truth or lie, whether we're talking about fake news, anytime we're talking about a copy that exists in a public realm, then we're talking about the context, the cultural context in which it's received, the political context, the semiotic context. So I think it's inescapable from a political question.
So that's kind of a question of judgment, I think, mainly. But like, you worked for a lot of arts organizations and crafts, Victoria and so forth. So has there been conversations and the discussion is like, is this an original work? Just copying someone else? Is that something, I'm sure it's something which came up. So what's kind of the insight there? Like, where do these conversations go? Because, there is also often, I think, that there are topics up in the air, and then maybe someone got first known for it, and someone else might have worked on it for longer, but comes into the public realm much later. So how do you go about if you get proposals where you think, I've seen that, I know this, what am I going to do with this?
Yeah, it is a really rich and interesting question, because on the one hand, the entire history of artistic practice, of design practice, of architectural practice is about responding to one another's work. An artist and maker create something, there's something that the next artist or maker responds to, the idea is elaborated, we can speak, we can look around this room and recognize the visual and aesthetic and cultural markers of work from a particular era because of what is recognizable there in each one. Who was the first to create a gilt lion's foot chair leg? There's just that notion of where the original is really complex. So then we ask the question in a contemporary setting, as you were saying, in terms of my line of work, then it tends to be about questions of the ownership of intellectual property. So how can we define that an artist, this is the way in which the artist sees this particular work, and what is referenceable, what is reproducible, but what is really unique to that artist and to that work. And then when we also add the additional cultural layer, for example, if we're talking about First Peoples culture, then did this artist have the right to refer to or reproduce aspects of this work? If we're talking about plagiarism, intellectual property theft, then to what extent does someone have the right to borrow or to appropriate? And when does something become appropriation in a sort of a culturally damaging way? Or when is it, that kind of reference point? So we've been through, in terms of the eras of artistic discussions, the postmodern pastiche where anything goes, and now we're very much in a place of increasing and really strong, I think, and responsible cultural awareness. That we started out by saying we are on the lands of the Bunurong, the Boonwurrung, and the Woiwurrung people, and this is just one place, one complex contested place in Australia, of which there are hundreds of places and traditional owners and cultural heritage and intangible cultural heritage. So there are formal protocols now, and they tend to be recognised by things like government bodies, funding bodies, so that artists who are not Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander have guidance in terms of the limits of referencing, appropriation, purporting to, create something or tell a story that's not theirs to tell. And then there's all the complexities of intellectual property law and so on. And so that question of the original and the double becomes an aesthetic one, a political one, and a very complex cultural one as well.
That's very interesting. Now you're really trapping me in that conversation on going into the more political even more. So, I mean, like, as someone who is kind of a migrant and not, that connected to Australian culture, to be honest, but very much interested and engaged with collaborations and exchange with Indigenous culture and trying to learn from it, and even writing about what we could learn from it. And we had that discussion just a couple of weeks ago at Sahans, where it was exactly that point. You have to be careful after 30 years of cultural appropriation. But so there was a conversation which had to do with to acknowledge who is the original owner of that thought and that culture is the most important thing, and to be prepared to be challenged and learn from it, but at the same time to start engaging with it, because otherwise I think there might be the danger with the appropriation that you even enforce the kind of segregation more by being afraid of actually engaging. Yeah, so I mean, when I started working with students with Indigenous questions and topics and connecting to the Wakola at Cape York and the Judge Wurrung in Victoria, basically there's almost like a warning sign going off, be careful and so forth. And I found that kind of not helpful in a way to open up a conversation. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, but I think that's a really, I would like to hear your position on that, because, I'm with regional Victoria and so forth, I'm sure, and as you said, it's something which comes up again and again. So there are protocols as an acknowledgement. You can't tell a story of someone else, of course, if it's a cultural one. But where do you see is kind of the potential of learning from each other and engaging with each other? Because I think that's something we should really foster. And we can go down a little bit that track, and then we might go back to something more related to the collection. But I think it's a really interesting and a very contemporary discussion and theme you touched on there, and you have a lot of experience there.
I think so. It's exactly what you say about that mindset, or that approach that is about learning. So if, as white fellows, we go into a sort of a context of First Nations stories, objects, and we go into with the mindset that I'm not the person with the right, with the authority to offer a definitive account of this, then that already puts us, hopefully, in a learning mindset, so I want to find out, I want to know. And I think that's very important, especially in a country with a history, of dreaming since time immemorial, but a history of colonization, which is not told in any kind of open, authentic way, and that centres First Peoples. But you just reminded me, you were asking earlier about that notion of an origin and that potential, that sort of circularity of original and copy, and I'm from a Greek background, as you know, and so I spent a lot of time in Greece and exploring, I guess, some of the specifics of my cultural heritage, but also some of the really pursuing some of the objects, some of the artifacts of what has become that sort of Western European cultural markers, the aesthetic, some of the reference objects of many of the objects in this room, for example. And I remember being in Korintho, in in Corinth, and in a small museum, and there's an object in the corner about the size of it was quite enormous, actually, maybe a cubic meter. And this object was one of the most perfectly preserved Corinthian orders I had ever seen. It was, a couple of thousand years old. It was for those of us who are not architects or designers, the order is sits. Sorry, it was a capital, not an order. The capital sits at the top of a column, so it's the fancy bit at the top of a column, and the Corinthian column is the one with the sort of fancy, what looks like flowers and things. So the Ionian one has the little curls, and the Doric one is just the horizontal markers. The Corinthian one is kind of a little bit curly. And I thought, how is it
decorative
so?
One.
What's that?
The decorative one.
The decorative
one.
That's
So,
right.
I mean, we're having this decorative arts conversation as well. So it's the most
Very
decorative
much,
one.
yeah. You'll find all over Fermoy House objects, items of furniture that have, particular decorative features that are inspired by the Corinthian capital. And so how was this so well preserved? So I took a look at the little didactic panel. It said that this was the original Corinthian capital, which had been preserved, I don't know, in dirt, underground, it was discovered in this certain way. And I was staring at this object thinking, how on earth could anyone lay claim to this being the original?
Original, yeah, that's what I was thinking when you said it, the original, like.
And, so you're there in Corinth, the origins of the Corinthian culture. And this museum was, this is maybe 25 years ago, it was a fairly small museum. And so I had a lovely conversation with someone who was volunteering, so not the curator, but a community member who was offering an account of the objects. And she explained that what they meant by original is that there were many such objects that were used as models so that craftspeople could create a reproduction. And so original in the sense that it was an original copy or an original model, an original prototype. It was never intended structurally to form, the structural support of a building. It was only meant to be copied. And I was just utterly fascinated by this object that exists only to be duplicated.
But that's a bit like architecture plans. So it's like the instructions define the original work. I mean, it's conversation and a problem I had with this work I'm creating here with a fellowship that, normally the artist, the idea is that the artist would do the work themselves, which is not true since a long time. I mean, Andy Warhol didn't do it, nor did Leonardo da Vinci. So they had a factory and a manufacturing, a whole cohort of people working on things. But it's basically the original, as you said before, that when you talked about your crafts and arts leadership positions, like it's more about the conversation and the kind of intellectual grounding the artist can articulate, which makes it an original work. If you compare two things and one can't say anything and the other one can explain a lot what that meaning of that would be, of course, that would be the more, I'm not saying original, but maybe the more interesting part. Because
but that's really interesting now, because then you sort of talk about, okay, there is a supplementary object and it is the thing that is giving us the confidence that this thing is original. And then we get to all the sort of cultural framing of the original and the copy. And so I was, the story I just gave, I was immediately mistrustful of this didactic panel because it claimed that this was original. And then I started thinking, this is a small museum, it's perhaps it's volunteer run, perhaps it's more community focused. So then why was I thinking that being a small community focused museum was less of a cultural authority? Because for all I knew, this small museum had an oral history tradition going back 2,000 years to the people who were 3,000 to the people who were actually crafting these objects. So it then goes to my preconceptions and what I was taking to be the marker of, authenticity.
Yeah. No, I get it. It's also the thing that I often complain that people don't have an opinion anymore and they wait for someone else to say this is something where, that's really solid and good and original and worth millions of dollars, while something else we don't trust because no one's talking about it or something, but it doesn't make it less valuable. It's just like, it's kind of this mechanism of markets as well in the arts world. So someone pays a lot for it, then someone else thinks that must be good. Maybe I pay a lot for it as well, or even more.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this value system we're having, and that's very Western.
Very much so. And I think, it brings back what is inextricably political about this, that, to recognize that an artist's work is worth something, you would have to have seen something of the artist's work before, but it can't have been this particular work, otherwise this is a forgery, a substitute, one of a series, not a unique and valuable work. And so, and then it's, that question of, okay, so what gives that particular artwork or the series its authenticity? Was it sold by a particularly well-known auction house or one of those smaller places? Was it, so all these things that we ask, which then takes us away from our own judgment, our own aesthetic. Going back to what we're saying about things like the contemporary political conversation and fake news and the protests we've seen in recent days around people who are not willing to accept the cultural markers that we all accept around a scientist's word being the thing we need to rely on in order to stay safe. So we're now in a situation where the perceptions that people have around what is legitimate, what is authentic, when those are politically manipulated, this threatens our safety, our community cohesion. It's a deeply unsettling thing to feel that the basis on which we make judgments are not common, are not shared among a community, and that they can be politically manipulated. So the notion of truth or lie, origin or otherwise is as I was saying at the outset of our conversation, it is fundamentally important and very, very a very timely moment to be having the conversation.
No, that got much more political than I was thinking it would be, to be honest. So
that's the problem when you invite me.
Well, I should have known what I got into. But I could go on about this much longer. But I think we might get into territory where I might not be on recording anymore, to be honest. So, but I think, so in the context of, let's go for a moment back to the kind of arts and crafts and that world, and the work we created with this fellowship. So to take an original as an inspiration, or even as the starting point by creating what we've done, digital copies, but then manipulating them and making an own work out of it, I would claim that is again an original, because we all get inspirations from somewhere else. I mean, nothing gets created in an empty void, whether it's cultural, political, social, aesthetic, material based. So I think, but that was something I struggled for a long time with, but I think I came to the point that by even creating digital copies and then reinterpreting them is an original work. But I like your opinion on that.
Well, I guess it's when we think about a digital copy and something which is which has set out with the intent to copy, to document, to understand. I mean, of course, any copy is an interpretation. It's choosing its particular reference point. But when I look at the work that's emerged from this fellowship, what we're talking about is something that adds considerable and quite extraordinary richness to what could never have been imagined possible for the objects in this collection. So the phenomenal increase in resolution of a digital copy and what is afforded in that, the fact that new things can be perceived which wouldn't otherwise have been possible, the fact of being able to touch, to approach, to manipulate something in so many other ways. And of course, when we walk into a space like this and the structure of it, the placement of objects, we as the viewer, as the audience, we tend to take, a certain posture. We're on our best behaviour. We're not going to touch anything. And so when you have that mindset, when you enter any gallery or museum, let alone when it used to be someone's home, you can't help but be in this mindset that is already, I think, flattening your scope of perception. Mm-hmm. And so the work that you've created has expanded and exploded the potential scope of what we can perceive in objects that people have been looking at for a very long time.
Yes, and it's a play with the format in a way as well. So the question of the collection, the collector's item, and the original piece, and then the digital copy, which everyone could take home, and in an augmented reality world, anyone could display in their interiors and experience. Which is something which will happen in the near future. I'm very sure about that. That becomes like a very democratic process of something highly precious, which then becomes available to everyone. So it's not, you don't have to be privileged. You just have to get the QR code. Basically, you have to have an internet connection. Which of course is also a privileged position. Not everyone in the world has an internet connection.
Well, that's right.
Smartphone.
And a good internet connection. As we've been speaking, I've been looking more and more at the objects in the room, and just they are just they are all along the line, this long line of reproductions and reproductions and reproductions of so many referenced high European styles. This is a situation where even the original objects, the actual objects in this room, they are each themselves in a particular semiotic place in a very, very long order of deferral. They're quite, they're each like, a word or a meme or something still being reproduced.
Yeah, and a reference to another place, to another time, to another society, to another life, to someone's collection, to a very big figure, David Roche, and a very important collection. But I think it's really interesting to engage with this Fermoy House and the collection, and I thank very much the foundation who made all of this possible, and the UniSA and the SIDA Foundation. And I thank you, Esther, for this conversation. This was great. We could go on for a long time, as usual.
We could.
But I think, in the interest, we touched on a very political, very art and artistic and decorative arts-based conversation. So I think we covered quite a good field. So this is one of many conversations during the fellowship, and one of the upcoming one will be with Geraldine Barlow, Head of International Art for the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, Quagoma in Brisbane. And the title is Copies in Contemporary Art Practice. So this one will very much focus on examples and artists who work with copies in their artwork. Thanks again, Esther, for coming. Thank you all for listening and joining in, and we hope you enjoyed it. And thanks to the foundation, and we say bye-bye.